We can.
Yep.
Good. Please let me know if there's any difficulties in seeing what I'm showing to you. Desks doubtless had their origin in the old monkish establishments, since in the early Middle Ages, the cowled brethren were the scribes of the community. In England, similarly, in the case of chairs, we have the book rests and reading rests attached to the choir fittings of our cathedrals and minsters. But apart from these instances, there is a lamentable lack of homemade desks of the earlier periods. The wealth of Gothic desks, such as we see in missal paintings, have hardly a counterpart in this country. At the Victoria and Albert Museum, however, is an English writing desk of the 15th century, carved with perpendicular arches, simple in design and solid in construction. Thus wrote Fred Roe in 1908, the first published reference to a medieval oak desk at the V&A, at a time when early British furniture barely featured in the museum's collection at all. The piece in question had arrived in South Kensington 10 years earlier with no illustrious reputation, having been spotted by a curator in 1898 and bought for the modest sum of £12 from C.W. and J.H. Brown, antique furniture and china dealers in Oxford Street, apparently just one of London's many workaday antique shops catering to a wide variety of tastes. What the museum then characterized as a very rare example of English church furniture circa 1500, whose value consists in its historical character, has passed an unobtrusive century in the museum, despite Fred Roe's interest, and more recently, the vigorous reappraisal of Charles Tracy, who redated it by 100 years to 1375 to 1400, and calls it an extremely rare example of a medieval desk cum book cupboard, without doubt authentic and English, drawing comparison with woodwork at York, Lincoln, and Chichester cathedrals. Its display in the Dr. Susan Weber Gallery of Furniture, after several decades in store, provided an opportunity to reconsider attribution, form, and function. Was it for reading or writing, or both? Was it for personal or institutional use? For example, a writing desk from a monastic scriptorium, or a lectern from a chapter house or refectory. It's useful to recall, I think, that in Europe before 1455, a desk was not envisaged in terms of printed books, but manuscripts and manuscript books produced by hand with long labour at a wooden slope. We do not know what kind of desk Chaucer or his scrivener Adam, to whom he addresses a poem, we don't know what kind of desk they used when composing his texts in the late 14th century, but a writing slope seems to have been the preferred standard for professional scribes and scholars alike when dealing with sheets of parchment and paper or bound volumes. Might the V&A desk be reappraised as a unique survivor from the founding years of English literature, as well as a landmark in early furniture? In the few brief notices that it has received, a common thread is the frequency with which desks are prominently illustrated in broadly contemporary manuscripts. But this wealth of evidence has not hitherto been explored. The purpose of this paper is to contextualize the desk against this pictorial evidence, to reassess it in the light of new dendrochronological analysis, and by comparison with other surviving medieval desks and writing furniture. And I would like to offer it in grateful appreciation to two outstanding experts in the field of English medieval furniture and woodwork, to whom I and many others are indebted: Charles Tracy and Hugh Harrison. My paper is divided into three sections. Firstly, a close look at the remarkable design and construction of the V&A desk, a brief review of other surviving analogous woodwork, and thirdly, the analysis of desks as depicted in 15th century imagery. The desk is a freestanding oak unit reminiscent in form of a modern lecture theatre lectern, nearly square in footprint. It now reaches to about adult hip height, just below a metre high, but at some time before 1898, it was cut horizontally across the base or footing, and an elm board has been inelegantly nailed from underneath, which you can see down here, bottom left. The expansive sloping top set 38 degrees to the horizontal is comfortably wide enough to accommodate an open folio volume. Bordering all four sides of the slope runs a cavetto moulding, which we're seeing here. 3 of the 4 are original, but counterintuitively, perhaps, not the lower edge running along. Along the top edge, 2 small sections which I've highlighted are neatly cut away. The sloping top is now dark with age and wear and includes heavy scratching, notably a large, deep, deliberate X and a grid-shaped scratched near to the top, which is not easily visible in my photographs. The slope can be fully raised on plain, narrow hinges. Fixed to the underside, allowing the lid to be propped partly or fully open, are 3 iron rods. These are clearly not medieval, but there are signs that they replace something serving a similar purpose. Although the current lock is evidently not original, it must replace one that had received a hasp, which is now missing. The venerable nail fixings of the hasp are visible on the upper face of the lid. And it's this area where those fixings may be glimpsed. A metal lock was a standard feature of good quality late medieval chests. The relatively high cost of metalwork in the period means that they were never fitted casually and thus deserve special scrutiny. With the lid raised, an open cavity is revealed, and running just below the hinges, a shallow horizontal groove, this area that I'm indicating with my cursor. This lines up with a mortise at either end, cut into the uprights. And I imagine that this groove held a narrow shelf, perhaps about 3 fingers deep. Such shelves have been noted inside 14th and 15th century continental chests, but they're not usual in English examples. And I think they would have been very useful to keep small items close at hand. Further down inside the body of the desk, there are signs of 2 full depth shelves at 4 inches, and I'm showing you a cutout here, and 8 inches above the current bottom. The bottom shelf is lost, but in the upper position, a replacement elm shelf, this pale wood here, has been inserted on hinges and may plausibly replicate the original. The level of this upper shelf is a comfortable distance to reach down inside. Access to the lower compartment underneath would have been easily concealed, providing an added layer of security for less frequently accessed items. The desk sides and front, I fear we may be missing one of my views, but we will catch up, I'm sure. The desk sides and front present an impressive effect of architectural unity. Let's go back here. Though abruptly truncated at the base with 2 tiers of blind tracery. And if we go back to here, this may be more useful. The designs, in fact, differ on the 2 sides, although I can see no obvious reason for this. The tracery is contained within a series of mouldings, a powerful sense of vertical ascent defined by the angle of the sloping lid, balanced by the horizontal rhythm of arcading. By contrast, the back, if we look at this left-hand image, the back of the desk where a reader would stand or sit presents 2 large planes, the upper slope on which a text would be placed, and below it a large plane panel area. Across the structural midriff, these are linked by 2 arresting, finely carved lion masks. All commentators have assumed that the desk has been reduced in height. At the bottom, woodworm damage is visible, which may explain the radical surgery and the elm repairs. These could have been effected at almost any time before purchase by the V&A in 1988, but the plainness of the repairs and the handmade nails suggest to me 17th or 18th century, at which time the desk would already have been viewed as an ancient curiosity. I think, yes, Seen from the front, the abrupt transition of arcading to the elm bottom board now in place suggests to me the removal of an embattlement of the lower story of tracery, this being the embattlement that we're missing underneath. But seen from the back, it's less easy to visualize a substantial continuation below the intact bottom rail. So if this area was higher, what was going on down here? The question of what is missing is important to understanding the original height and function of the desk, specifically as to whether it was used standing or seated for reading or writing, or both. And if I move forward now, I want to point out, as will be discussed below, medieval desks sometimes seem to have incorporated a plinth or platform that continued under the user's feet, as we're seeing in this illustration, and which would have helped maintain the rigidity of the unit and insulate a reader from a cold floor. On the V&A desk, there is telltale evidence of some sort of extension to the back of uprights, where at about 8 inches above floor level, we can see large broken off wooden dowels that I've highlighted. In its relatively pale coloured oak, the desk differs from much furniture of this early period, to which dark varnishes have been customarily applied to protect the timber, conceal restorations, or conform to a preferred dark aesthetic. Inside the V&A desk are drip marks indicative of liquid surface stripping. Close examination of the crevices of the woodwork revealed tiny traces of both orangey red and whitish paints, the white possibly a ground layer. But unfortunately, there's not enough to draw any conclusion, not enough evidence to draw any conclusion from this beyond the observation that the desk was at one time painted and effectively stripped at some time before 1898. Moving now to the desk in context. I want to consider the question of how this design of the desk was realized in terms of construction. So how might we expect it to be built? Two types of Northern European medieval woodwork with carved decoration have survived in relative quantity. Movable chests of various sizes and built-in church choir stalls, which though variously configured, generally consist of a long bench with vertical backrest or a series of individual stalls paired with a full-length sloping lectern top. Stalls may exhibit both impressively precise joinery and fine carving. Chests, though simple in form, were made using various and sometimes ingenious methods of construction. The V&A desk shares certain characteristics with both chests and stalls, but resembles neither. It must have presented to its designer a series of challenges to be resolved, to be both container and platform, combining a hinged, sloping top with the requirements of ergonomic functionality. It also had to look satisfyingly finished from all four sides. It is perhaps not surprising, therefore, that the desk is more complex structurally than it first appears. The hinge lid is constructed relatively simply using 3 butted and doweled boards, under which were nailed 2 long iron hinges, whose anchoring ends are tenoned into the top rail of the desk. These hinges give every appearance of being original, and if so, are remarkable testament to the longevity and effectiveness of this design. But I haven't had the opportunity in the last year to have additional help on the ironwork. The care with which the overall design was developed is revealed too by the moulded edging around the lid. Along each side, as I mentioned, which I highlight with my cursor on the upper left here, the separate batten was applied, but along the top, this moulding was actually pre-carved from the solid thickness of the uppermost board. So a lot of thought and preparation had gone into this. And I'd like to thank, in particular, Richard Sheppard for these drawings, which were produced under rather difficult circumstances because he couldn't come and see the desk with me. So he was relying on my scribbled and no doubt sometimes fluffy measurements. And he worked extremely late this week in order to get these ready for us to look at. For the main structure of the desk, the frame is created by 4 substantial corner uprights, rectangular in profile, but close to 3 inches square. At the traceried front of the desk, not where a user would stand, these are tenoned into the similarly substantial horizontal top rail, and at the back, the user's side, into the sloping side rails. Each sloping side rail, with its expressive lion mask projecting at its lower end, must have required great skill and experience, both to design and cut. At its upper end, it is tenoned into the front rail in such a way that it does not interfere with the adjacent tenon belonging to the front upright. The lower end is cut with two adjacent mortices for the joints with the back upright and the back top rail. To someone familiar with frame and panel construction, generally considered to evolve at the end of the 15th century, it's natural, I think, to read the desk as containing a series of tracery panels on the sides and front and a single large panel on the back, the user's side. However, close inspection shows that each face of tracery on the sides and front is composed of full height boards carved in the solid, 2 on each side and 3 on the front. So here we are seeing the 2 boards to the side and the 3 on the front. And these vertical boards are linked by horizontal dowels, now visible where the boards have shrunk across their grain. Each large section of tracery was then fitted into the main framework held within rebates. At mid-height, what appears on each side to be a moulded rail enclosing the panels above and below is mainly for an appearance. This is what I'm talking to. An applied moulding pegged to the tracery and matched within, which you don't see here, by a plain batten. But even more striking is the back of the desk, which appears to comprise a large panel consisting of 2 horizontal boards held within a framework. In fact, the top rail here and the upper board are actually the same piece of wood carved to shape and secured to the upright at an elegantly finished joint with a pegged tenon. Below this deep shaped rail are 2 horizontal boards which are retained in a groove cut into the 3-inch thick bottom rail. And I don't believe that either of these lower boards has tenons to them, but without X-ray, it's impossible to be sure. This method of construction must have been laborious, but provides impressive structural solidity of particular value if the desk had to be moved. More on that later. While the use of large scantlings with delicate surface ornament bears comparison with the carpentry of church stalls of the period, the form of the desk is much more complex, as I hope you can see here, and cannot be considered a development of stalling. The architectonic character of the desk perhaps invites another analogy to the conception and techniques of masonry, where a static design in stone is composed using a few substantial elements, elaborately cut, ornamented and jointed. In a similar way, perhaps, the mason's mitre in woodwork remains in use for frame and panel joinery for several decades before the joiner's mitre, more suitable to the cutting in timber than stone, becomes commonplace around the mid-16th century. However, the evolution of joined furniture constructions means that there is no need to consider the construction of the desk either as a particularly early phase of frame and panel or as something conceived by a mind more familiar with the principles of stonework. From as early as the 13th century, English clamped chests, as we know them, of the type already referred to this morning, such clamped chests were being constructed in similar ways with large shaped framing pieces with massive tenons that are reminiscent of the desk's top rail. What is different about the desk is the complexity of its form and the elegant efficiency of its construction. Far from being an adaptation of either stalls or chests, it represents, I think, an inventive and strikingly accomplished approach to design by someone versed in the technical woodworking skills required to make it. The desk has always been described as English, a hypothesis developed more fully through Charles Tracy's detailed analogies to characteristically stilted trefoil tracery at Lincoln and York cathedrals, and the treatment and placing of the lion masks at Lincoln and Chichester. And I don't have time today to go further into those stylistic questions. Conversely, ideas about dating have varied widely since it was first published. from Charles Tracy's attribution 1375 to 1400 to the early years of the 16th century. The results of dendrochronology carried out by Ian Tyers in 2012 can now be applied to complement Tracy's stylistic analysis. Two types of oak were identified. For the carved panels, planks of very straight, slow growth Eastern Baltic oak, and for most, if not all, of the structural framework, irregular, faster growth oak from small trees with distinctive shakes, the visible natural shrinkage, and distortion, which is typical of English timber used before it was fully seasoned. And I was quoting Ian Tyers in that short description. Without removing the baseboard of the desk, which would almost certainly cause damage, or adopting the micro-boring method, dendrochronology could be used only on the three boards of the hinged lid, not the main carcass structure of the desk, in what is presumably a more local source of timber. This means that a regional provenance could not be established using scientific analysis in 2012. The lid boards were found to be oak from two Eastern Baltic trees, which were still growing in 1420. The surface characteristics of the board indicate that they were worked while still green or unseasoned, implying a dating for use of around 1430 to 50. The straight, even growth of Baltic oak facilitated conversion into large boards and thin panels, whose excellent working characteristics offset the import costs, leading to a well-established trade with England from the early 13th century. This use of Baltic wainscot oak, as we called it, in combination with local fast-growth timber, has been found in good quality 14th and 15th century furniture produced in England, predominantly in the eastern regions, but it has also been identified in movable French furniture. Given some of the unusually refined technical features of the desk, the possibility of a continental origin could be explored further. Its appearance in London in the 1890s, easily explained by the wholesale cross-channel trade in ecclesiastical woodwork that began after the upheavals caused by the French Revolution. At this point, the English origin proposed by Charles Tracy remains, in my view, the most plausible. The dendrochronological data stretches Tracy's stylistic dating by about 50 years, but not implausibly so, since continuities and changes in English woodwork from the first half of the 15th century may depend on local factors as much as the influence of stylistic evolution. And this looks as though it will be one of the themes for today's program. What, for example, if the desk were commissioned to match woodwork produced 2 generations earlier, or by someone who simply favored a slightly older fashion, the fashions of their youth? Having considered the material evidence offered by the desk itself, I want now to turn to comparable late medieval European desks on the basis that early furniture consisted largely of types rather than unique pieces. Surviving desks are extremely rare. Only a tiny fraction of all medieval furniture has survived, even taking account of fixed furniture and heavy-duty chests that survive mainly in church buildings. Of many types that undoubtedly existed, barely a single example still remains. A full survey of medieval furniture associated with books and study is far beyond the scope of this paper, but 3 basic types can be described in brief. The library desk for seated readers, secondarily, the lectern for a standing reader, and thirdly, the study desk for a seated writer or reader. Although I am conscious that the last 2 categories may sometimes be hard to separate, the lectern for a standing reader and a study desk for a writer. Of the first type, the multi-user library desk used by seated readers in a chained library, several histories have been published based largely on some outstanding examples. These fall within 2 basic subtypes, those for standing readers and those for readers seated on either an integral or movable bench. The slope is set more steeply than the V&A desk, typically 45 to 60 degrees. Closely contemporary with the V&A desk, there survive at Lincoln Cathedral 3 of the 8 or 10 library oak desks provided circa 1422 when the library was equipped. The tall structure presents on each side a solid slope angled to about 45 degrees, on which could be set the books, each one attached by a chain to a high-level shelf running the full length of the desk up here. Originally, a simple full-length bench seat extended at a set distance from each side of the desk, as illustrated on the right by Streeter earlier in the 20th century. In terms of design evolution, it is as if a regular 15th century church pew with poppy head bench ends has grown to twice its normal height, and on each side produced a gently angled arm from its midriff, as well as a second bench seat facing backwards. Although study in the 15th century, as now, would have entailed the taking of notes, these desks were essentially for the reading, not the writing of texts. Lincoln Cathedral possessed no scriptorium, indeed. Although the Lincoln desks can be compared with the V&A desk in several ways, their bookish purpose, slope, their dating, their use of oak, and the presence of carved decoration, there are several basic differences which limit the comparison. They are double-sided and accommodate multiple readers. They are removable, having been installed in relation to the architectural design of the library. They offer no internal storage for the books to be read, which were chained to the shelves above, as I've mentioned. These are open structures, presenting limited planes for decoration. The second type of reading furniture is the lectern used by a standing reader or cantor addressing a congregation or group. They were made in a range of materials, not only wood, and a range of forms, some of which were mobile. As well as the distinctive eagle lectern, which was probably more common in wood than brass, although the latter has survived in greater numbers, medieval English lecterns were desk-shaped and occasionally offered book storage, though not on the scale of those Italian lecterns with a cupboard unit sufficient to hold very large volumes such as antiphonars, such as the one on the left from Perugia. Lecterns are clearly designed to be used by a standing reader, and the single or double book slope is usually set at a steep angle to aid legibility and voice projection. As a piece of furniture that's to be the focus of attention in church, it's not surprising that their design and decoration are sometimes conspicuous. Here, I'd like to review two notable surviving wooden lecterns that are associated with religious institutions, but which are nonetheless closely comparable in form and size to the V&A unit and thus deserve some attention. The walnut and marquetry lectern with hinged slope, now at the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaisme in Paris, is believed to be a Torah pulpit or bimah from northern Italy between 1440 and 1480. In the Ashkenazi tradition, a bimah would be placed in the center of the room and the Torah scroll supported on it and read aloud. The decoration, though lacking Jewish inscriptions, extends to all four sides and corresponds closely to that on the Holy Ark from Modena, dated 1472, and that's the basis of its attribution. The oak lectern desk or pult of the 1490s, now in the Bayerische National Museum, Munich, almost certainly came from the Martinskirche Landshut, a collegiate chapter composed of priests in southern Germany. This compact unit has a notably gentle slope with a ledge retainer. It stands on a molded base and has expertly composed and carved Gothic tracery on the sides, in contrast to the plain, double-panelled front. At the back, where a reader would stand, twin doors with neatly designed hinges and lockpate open on a raised interior compartment with two shelves, the foot cavity underneath allowing a reader presumably to stand comfortably close to the desk itself. Although the desk matches the choir stalls produced in the 1490s, it does not seem to have formed part of that ensemble, and its original location and intended function are still uncertain. Although both the bimah and the Martinskirche pult are similar to the V&A desk in their overall dimensions and in displaying prominent decoration, there's a significant difference in terms of use. Their shallowed angled slopes are positioned too high to have been used comfortably by someone seated. As is suggested by the buildings with which they're associated, their function was surely a lectern for a standing reader. Of my third category, the medieval writing desk intended for a single seated reader-writer, I have not found other surviving examples, so I'd be most grateful if anyone knows of some. But with so few comparable desks available, the survival, albeit in mutilated form, in England of a mid-15th century oak book cupboard with sloping top does seem to be of potential relevance to this discussion. Like the previous two pieces, it too highlights the difficulties of neat characterization. I beg your pardon, of neat categorization. The unit in the Vicar's Library, Wells Cathedral, for which it is presumed to have been made, has been dated circa 1450 by comparing its ironwork with that used elsewhere in the building. Though, as we've heard, that may not be a watertight method. The cupboard unit is too wide at 5 foot 2 inches, 157 centimeters, to be intended for a single user, and it has two short hinged doors, one with a lock. It now stands on low legs, and there is some suspicion that these may have been somewhat reduced. At each end of the cupboard's flat top rises a shaped upright, 40 centimeters high, this area. And it's been argued that these supported a full width slope angled to about 45 degrees, and I find that suggestion convincing. Behind the slope, a steep curve in the profile, referring to this area with my cursor, that steep curve in the profile suggests to me that it was left open at the back. The cupboard is a boarded or nailed construction, and its blockish form cannot be described as elegant, but its iron hinges and lock plate indicate it was not an insignificant commission. Is it then a desk with a storage, or a cupboard with a sturdy slope, with a study slope? The flat top reaches to tabletop height, while the slope would have provided a useful surface on which to consult and compare books stored within. The illustration, circa 1456, depicting the author Jean Mielot, who worked for the Duc de Bourgogne, in his workshop, shows him writing at a steeply angled slope set on top of a chest-like cupboard placed in the middle of the room. A second lectern on metal bracket appears to be mounted from the same unit. Up here. Unlike Mielot's desk, the Wells unit's width and plain back, that may be easier. Unlike the Mielot's desk, the Wells unit's width and plain back suggested it was placed against a wall. Perhaps the Wells unit has more in common with another piece of furniture in Mielot's study, the wide built-in book cupboard with 5 elaborate tracery carved doors, above which is a full-width steep slope with ledge on which closed and open books are arranged. So I'm referring to this larger unit. Fitted somehow to its superstructure are a range of inkwells and 2 drawers, each one large enough to contain another substantial volume as well as various scribal utensils. Mielot's elegantly executed book cupboard may be said to represent ideal quality design and workmanship, while the Wells unit fulfills a similar function, but in a more workaday style. And very briefly, 3 further illustrations, all dated around 1500, show somewhat comparable units, 2 with bilateral tops, suggesting how illustrations can infuse surviving but mutilated furniture with new possibilities. For the third part of my talk, I want to explore further the plentiful evidence provided by northern manuscripts and paintings of the 15th and 16th centuries, in the hope that they may assist in contextualizing and understanding the V&A desk. It's important to remember that professional, or should we say vocational, writing conventionally took place in 2 types of locations. One was the monastic scriptorium, designed for multiple scribes, often constructed within a cloister and supposed to be utilitarian in character, and of which, alas, I found no illustrations. The second type of study space, of writing space, was the private study, for want of a better word, whether ecclesiastical or secular, of which illustrations are relatively plentiful. I consulted about 30 depictions of desks for the use of a single reader or writer, my third category. These range over a long period from about 1400 to 1525, and having been produced mainly in Flemish and French workshops, none purports to show a specifically English interior. Caution is required when interpreting such images, because in every case, the artist's concern was not primarily to portray furniture accurately. Would that it were. Conventions leading to the reuse of images and artistic license inevitably play a part, sometimes a considerable one, in some scenes that seem to be deliberately fantastical. We do have to be cautious. Nevertheless, it seems to me reasonable that many of the interiors and furnishings reflect plausible contemporary usage, albeit recast to suit a primary narrative. It may be a somewhat crude tool that I have applied selectively, but it offers another perspective on an otherwise misty field by which depictions and furniture may usefully inform one another. I have drawn 7 broad deductions about desks and writing as the two are depicted in these kind of illustrations. Firstly, comfort and convenience matter. Medieval desks are usually shown in comfortable, well-lit rooms that are provided with a fireplace, or apparently are not so large as to be difficult to heat. This seems hardly surprising if scholars were working in a concentrated manner for long periods of time. Desks are often placed close to windows, which may be adjusted to control the amount of light entering the room. Decorated floors, textile hangings, and cushions underline an expectation of comfort. Indeed, the room is sometimes a bedchamber or close to one. The desk is conveniently placed near wall shelves or a separate lectern or table for books or other accoutrements. Second, books are essential and have to be accommodated. Core to the functioning of the study were books whose heavy material presence and material fittings and metal fittings made them impossible to arrange in a modern style, closely arranged upright. Books of various sizes are often depicted adjacent to a desk, resting on sloping shelves or flat inside cupboards. The desk itself may offer internal storage for books. Commonly seen as a side opening in the desk, either open shelved or with a cupboard door. An open cupboard in front of the knees is seen occasionally, likewise a shelf immediately under the slope of the type commonly seen in front of choir stalls, like this example on the left. A lateral opening offers greater convenience than a knee hole, shelf or cupboard, or a hinge slope. But these lateral openings rarely seem large enough for more than a small volume or two, or perhaps, as we see on the right, a restorative beverage. Scholars never change. Thirdly, texts must be comfortably legible. Medieval desks offered stability with some degree of flexible positioning. They vary in form and size from the width of the user's own shoulders to twice that dimension, from about 25 to 50 inches, which would allow 2 or more texts to be compared directly. But these desks are always serving a single writer. The most common width is, I estimate, between 25 and 40 inches, which would provide sufficient room for a large folio to be examined. And this size corresponds with the V&A desk with a width of 34 inches. A different solution to the requirement of having 2 texts easily accessible was to provide a second adjacent lectern slope for the exemplar text mounted on an adjustable metal bracket rising from the text, as in these two. Little, if any, of this ingenious metalwork appears to have survived, but those represented are not, I think, implausible, given that any metal fitting was made to order. Fourthly, an unstable, rickety desk will not work. Regardless of its width, the height at which the slope is presented is governed by the need to accommodate a seated scribe. A desk needs to be stable with a solidly constructed foot or plinth. Whether the depicted user is a saint or the author of the text, the desks illustrated represent carefully designed, well-made furniture with mouldings and sometimes panels to help define form. It could also be argued that the dignity and authority of author and text in these illustrations require the portrayal of a decent quality desk, unless, of course, it's St Jerome, as we see on the right here, writing at a pointedly rustic item. Poorly made desks must, of course, have existed, but the plausibility of the desks portrayed, by and large, supports the sense that this level of quality might be reasonably hoped for, if not always obtained. Most desks cannot be described as portable, but their relatively modest size would allow them to be movable. Very few of those depicted are shown as being built in. Allowing the location of a room to be adjusted allowing the location of the desk to be adjusted within a room would optimize one's working position in relation to a window or hearth according to the season. Some illustrations show a different type of desk in two sections, which consists of a steep slope separate from the table on which it is set, but still solid enough to remain stable in use. This solution appears to anticipate the preference after 1500 for portable, shallow slope desk boxes, such as the sumptuous writing box associated with Henry VIII that I show in the middle. The design of such boxes probably also relates to the emergence in Spain, but quickly spreading across Europe, of the escritorio, a portable full front cabinet for papers and small items. My fifth deduction from this survey of illustrations is that scribes work seated, but that the type of seating varies. Chairs of various plausible designs are seen, as are benches and chests, which are of course likely to have been used to store books. Occasionally, the seat is integrated within a timber architectural ensemble comprising platform, seat and desk, perhaps additional shelvage, storage or shelving, although these units are sometimes less convincing as the representations of actual furniture. One unobtrusive feature that seems entirely plausible to actual usage is a footrest to help the writer maintain a comfortable position for long periods. In contrast, the knee hole, which is absent from the V&A unit, but a defining feature of multi-user library desks, and that would nowadays be considered ergonomically essential, is not universal in these depictions. Some scribes are shown sitting sideways to the desk, others perch forward, apparently in a relaxed and controlled position. I'm aware that this may be less a reflection of reality than pictorial conventions by which the scribe is being presented to the reader. But nonetheless, the evidence from these 30-odd illustrations is that not every desk was supplied with a knee hole. Sixth, a desk needs a slope. The defining feature of all writing desks is its slope, a characteristic they share with lecterns. At 38 degrees, the V&A desk aligns with the majority of desks depicted, which appear to vary between 30 and 50 degrees. Many indeed seem to be a neat 45 degrees, and this may reflect the urge to simplify construction or representation, or both, especially while maintaining perspectival proportion. While some gentler slopes may have been hinged, this is never shown explicitly. Steeper slopes are also seen, and it seems possible that they allowed a short-sighted scribe to work more comfortably. The ledge or lower edge lip is a feature of lecterns that one might imagine to be standard, but in fact, like the knee hole, is not always shown on otherwise carefully represented desks. Perhaps some scribes deemed a ledge unnecessary because the parchment or paper was pinned in place, or because a ledge would have interfered with the freedom of the wrist. You may recall that the lower edge moulding on the V&A unit is a later addition, perhaps reflecting a transition in function from writing to reading. And seventh, a desk needs a desk tidy. One aspect of the portrayal of desks that suggests naturalism and familiarity on the part of the artist, literally so with those images showing a scribe at work in his study, is the presence of scribal utensils and accessories such as pens, pen cases, inkwells for different inks, different colors, scissors, lenses, weighted ribbons to hold down the parchment, sometimes laid out on a handy built-in shelf, or affixed to the desk with a leather band, or in the case of inkwells, inset into the surface of the slope, as we see top left. Commonly seen to the side of the slope is an aperture or cubby hole, too small for a book, but so it's like the example here or here. An aperture or cubby hole, too small for a book, but apparently convenient as a repository for slips of parchment. Well, what does this partial survey of scribes and scholars at work suggest about single-user desks in Northern Europe in the 15th century? Firstly, that the artists depict solidly made wooden structures, often with ingenious and plausible details. Secondly, that the desks reflect the practical needs of scholars, providing book storage and a convenient writing surface. In most cases, they are used in conjunction with separate shelving of some kind. Thirdly, while carved ornament in contemporary patterns is not unusual, painted or gilded decorations is exceptional. While none of the depictions fully matches the V&A desk, almost all its basic characteristics are seen sufficiently frequently as to suggest that the V&A desk is no freak. I say, however, almost all, because none of the illustrations clearly shows a hinged lid, while cupboard doors are frequent. However, in a culture of chests, the hinged lid is an obvious solution that would quickly become established and, moreover, last the test of time despite its shortcomings. Furthermore, for the artists representing reading and writing in the 15th century, it's surely perverse to expect any of them to show not the definitive actions of reading or writing, but the peripheral moment when the user interrupts work to lift the lid and stick an arm or head inside. Please let me know, however, if you find a manuscript image of St Jerome rooting around inside an open desk for a lost quill or a mid-morning snack. How far, then, does the representation of desks and the evidence of surviving examples that I've reviewed inform an understanding of the V&A piece? It's clear that the desk is missing a base that would have provided a satisfactory termination to the ornament and established it as a piece with architectural standing, if I may use that word. Reimagining the embattlement of the lower story of tracery and a molded footing, the height overall of the desk would be raised, I think, by about 5 to 6 inches. The slope would, of course, also be higher, starting from just above conventional tabletop height. One argument against it having been even higher than this is that a substantially taller footing would require a user to stand and reach uncomfortably far within to find an item low down, lifting up that shelf that we saw at the beginning. Even allowing for a base of about 5 inches beyond what we see today, the desk would still be light enough and its construction stout enough to allow it to be moved short distances across the floor by 2 people if occasion demanded. Its size and angle of slope and the evidence provided by illustrations of comparable desks indicate that the V&A desk was not used as a lectern for a standing speaker to address auditors in a church, chapter house, or refectory, but seated primarily for writing, with the choice of seat a matter of personal taste and circumstances. The V&A desk is dual purpose in that it combines a surface suitable for writing or reading with capacious and internal storage that was protected both by a lock and a concealed lower compartment. The most likely contents must, of course, include books, which are generally recorded as being stored in chests or cupboards, but it could also have held materials for writing, or indeed, given the stoutness of the cupboard, documents that required careful preservation or other valuables. The narrow shelf that I suggest ran below the inside of the lid would have been convenient for writing utensils. It must be admitted that the desk does not combine the two functions of writing and storage with ease, because anything on the slope must be removed before raising the lid, or you risk it sliding off. A professional scribe would generally be copying an exemplar text, and while the slope is capacious, an additional work surface nearby, such as a lectern or table, would no doubt have been useful. Further evidence of the desk's practical design are the twin cutouts along the top edge that I pointed out up here. These twin cutouts, which could have located 2 weighted bands to help keep sheets of parchment or paper flat while writing, or a book, the pages of which from closing during the reading. Well, one of the many questions prompted by the desk concerns the medieval locations of furniture for writing. I would suggest that the absence of desks in liturgical spaces and the general, albeit sketchy, picture of monastic scriptoria as utilitarian spaces support a view of the V&A desk as professional furniture for a well-appointed study of the type so frequently illustrated. The close relationship between clergy and scribal culture in the 15th century means that an ecclesiastical context is surely most likely. While the desk as a type of furniture was not a conventional indicator of social status in the way that a bed or tiered buffet was evidently understood to be, the V&A desk, with its careful design and carved decoration, presupposes significant investment. It would also have represented its owner's lifelong learning and commitment to study. In a society defined by religious belief and practice, use of the desk must also have been inculcated with Christian sensibility. The idea that time spent at it and the text it facilitated should be in the service of God, even if matters of business, law, or poetry were conducted on it. The pair of lion masks on either side of and facing the desk's user may be read as reminders of vigilance against idle thoughts or evil thoughts, a warning against the devil on the prowl, or for their associations with the evangelist St Mark or St Jerome. With its well thought out design, use of imported oak, prominent decoration, the desk was clearly intended to be admirable as well as useful and durable. It must have been specially commissioned by someone of means and status. At the start of this paper, I asked how far the desk can be regarded as a unique survivor of writing culture from the founding years of English literature, from the age or shortly thereafter of its father, Geoffrey Chaucer. It is indubitably a rare survivor, but in one sense, the desk is also a dinosaur. Shortly after it was made, the explosion in the number of printed books available would have started to render the desk archaic. The change did not take place overnight, since some types of manuscript books enjoyed a golden age well into the early 16th century, and professional scribes continued to produce manuscript documents for much longer. But after the arrival of the printing press, the writing desk has changed in fundamental meaning. Furthermore, if we presume an English origin, a century after its making, the Protestant Reformation in England is likely to have entailed further fundamental changes in ownership, context, and function for the desk. By whatever fortuitous and mysterious circumstances it has survived, the desk therefore provides rare glimpses into the making, use, and value of furniture in late medieval Europe. Thank you.